Guys, it is an honor. Once again, I'm probably one of the most technologically challenged people on the planet. So hopefully you can see these slides. But kind of want to give you a big picture today of what I think the writing journey is, and I want to share some of my experiences. Now, first of all, I'm a surgeon, okay? I specialize in getting the meanness out of people. And I want to give you a secret that most surgeons don't tell you about surgeons. You see, there are good fast surgeons and there are bad fast surgeons, but there are no good slow surgeons. And so today I think the same translates for speaking and for surgery, okay? There are good fast speakers and there are bad fast speakers. I'm going to try to go through a lot of stuff, and I'm going to try to give you a framework which has helped me in my writing journey, and I hope it helps you a little bit. You may not be aware of this. You may not be aware of this, but this is an equation. It may have never crossed your mind, but there's an equation in your mind that describes how you handle your life circumstances, how you respond to your life events. Now, you can't see this equation, but it's a very complicated equation. Just relax. I'm not that smart, okay? I like to keep things very simple. But
that means you're brilliant. That's what that really means.
Well, actually, no. I mean, in fact, I'm the guy who failed my pre-math prerequisite in college. So I'm the most mathematically challenged person on the planet. But I want you to think of this in a framework of a formula that describes kind of how we, as writers, the challenges that we face. Many of you remember the day that Trump was inaugurated, whether for good or for bad, whatever your political beliefs are. I remember it for a very different reason. I remember the day because it was a Friday and I was clicking buttons in my office doing my electronic medical records at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and all of a sudden I heard this big loud explosion, like a boom outside of my office. And my computer went dead, my lights flickered, and I walked outside and everything was normal. The lights went back on and everything looked normal. And so then something, kind of clicked in my brain. What am I doing here on Friday afternoon clicking buttons when I could be home with my family? So I got in my car and I went home, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I got a call from the emergency room. And I turned on, of course I answered the phone, and I was about to give the nurses a piece of my mind. It's Friday afternoon, I'm not on call, what are you calling me for? And the nurse said, no, wait a minute. Your office is on fire. And so anyway, I turn around and I rush back to my office, and I know that you can't see this picture very well, but this is a picture of my office. My office burned up in smoke. This was pretty much my retirement plan. This was my practice. I'm in independent practice. And so I was facing a set of circumstances that I never expected to face. And so after the smoke cleared, the fire marshal let me and my wife walk through this destroyed building. And, so many memories and so many things that I'd invested my life in that building. And there's a little stairwell where I pray. And it's a little narrow stairwell, and I'm a very prayer challenged person too, so I have to kind of get on my knees and kind of, I get distracted easily, so I kind of walk up the stairwell on my knees, and I kind of wondered as I was walking through that hallway with all the soot and the insulation on the floor and all the everything charred and destroyed, what was that hallway going to be like? And as I turned the corner and as I went up that hallway, I realized that things would never be the same. Those circumstances were going to change my life, but there were some things that I could build my life on. There were 4 things in that stairwell that kind of gave me something to hold on to. The first thing was a Bible. It was an old Bible, and the smoke had charred the Bible. But one of the interesting things, those words were still there. Those principles, those practices, those precepts that we can all build our lives upon, The second thing that was there was an old doctor's bag. It's, the old kind of old-timey doctor's bag. The black smoke had charred the bag, and it had a fresh look on it. I realized that I still, even though I didn't have an office anymore, I still had a ministry. I still had an opportunity, to make a difference in people's lives with my work. The third thing is, as I went farther up the stairwell, there's these pictures of our 5 children. And my wife took all these pictures, and they're all in cowboy suits. And I realized as I turned that stairwell up there that that was one of the most important things. My family was there to influence. I still had people in my life that I really need to focus on influencing. And then up at the top of the stairwell, going up to my little office, a little room where I sleep sometimes when I'm on call, my wife had made this beautiful wall. It was this beautiful stained wall with a cross on it. And it just almost broke my heart because that wall was charred, black and soot. It was just hardly, distinguishable from anything else. But when I took that cross off the wall, I realized that behind that cross was this beautiful impression of the cross. Amidst all that darkness and amongst all that smoke and all that destruction was this beautiful imprint of the cross. And I thought, wow, sometimes in our lives we can't really understand why we go through these circumstances in our lives. But yet, one of the main things that God does often is He takes those circumstances and He imprints His image in our life, so that when people see those things in our life, He begins to reflect His image. And so today I want, as I begin to kind of build this equation for you, I want you to realize that we all face circumstances. We all face a set of life events, even with our writing. Whatever our writing challenges are, we've got some that, it sounds like there's a varied number of writers. We've got one that was just published recently. Congratulations, by the way. But we all face a different set of circumstances. And as we think about those circumstances today, there's a mixture. There's kind of an equation of circumstances, and they all mix into our lives. And today, kind of the big picture is I want you to realize the connection between your circumstances that you're facing as a writer and what God is doing. There's a connection between those two, and so often we don't make that connection between the things that are going on in our lives and the things that God is trying to squeeze out of us through those circumstances. Some of those circumstances are things, this is a CY, some of the circumstances are things that you bring on yourself, both positive and negatives, both by good and bad choices. Some of the circumstances we face are imposed by others on us. People have hurt us. And then on the other hand, there are people that have made a very positive impression in our lives. And there's some things like my office that I'm never going to understand. And all those things mixed together in this equation. But just once again, realizing that all of these things in your life are connected for a purpose, that God has a purpose for each one of these circumstances. And God wants to draw that out. And we talk about, writers always talk about write what you know. But it goes deeper than that, I think, for us, for those of us who have faith. It's writing about who we know, and it's writing about what God has taught us in those circumstances and some life lessons that we can express to others in different ways. Maybe it's a devotional, maybe it's a prophetic book, whatever kind of genre that you're writing. There's a nonfiction book or a fiction book. There's a way that we can express that in our writing. So we have to be aware of the connect between those two. So once again, we all have an outcome that we desire. Correct?
Yes.
For many of us, that outcome is we want to be on a New York Times best-selling author, or we want to have a platform of 10,000 people. Whatever that outcome is, we all have an outcome. And so the first level of thinkers are folks who have this equation where C equals O. In other words, the circumstances are solely, or the outcome of life is solely dependent upon the circumstances. Now you think about this. In order to change the outcome, first level thinkers think that you have to change the circumstances. Now we see often there's some real issues with that level of thinking. You see, it's a victim mentality. See, if you change the circumstances, you change the outcome. And so many people live their lives, they wear these victim lenses. And you can tell by a lot of times what they say. You know, if only my building didn't burn down, then the outcome would have been different. If only my building was maybe better insured, if I had insured for $6 million, then the outcome would have been different, you know. We have all these kind of things that go through our minds. We have this victim mentality so often. But you know, what's interesting about this equation is so often the things that happen in our life, the life events that we have, I mean, it's spilt milk. It's done. We can't change often the circumstances that we experience. And so there's another level of thinking, and I call this the second level. These are people who add another term to the equation, okay? I told you I'm not that smart, okay? I'm mathematically challenged. But these people look at life very differently. They say, now wait a minute. It's not what happens to you. It's how you respond to those circumstances that determines the outcome of your life. You see where I'm going with this? And there's a lot of truth to that, isn't there? So often it's not necessarily what happens, it's how we respond. You know, when I first heard that, it began to kind of, you can't see this picture, but I began to scratch my head and think about that. I mean, it sounds good, doesn't it? Let's beat ourselves over the head with that. You know, C plus R equals O. I call this the hero equation. The hero equation. You know, the hero equation says, kind of like Dr. Phil, you own it, right? You're in control, right? You're responsible, and guess what? You get the credit. So, this is Mr. Incredible. I don't know if you guys have kids or grandkids, but I love the Incredible movies. You remember Mr. Incredible? You remember what happened in the movie? Mr. Incredible saved the world, but there was a lot of collateral damage. That's what we see often with heroes, isn't it? We save the world and we do all the good things, but yet we have met the enemy, and the enemy is ourselves. So often we hurt people. You know, heroes hurt people. And so thinking about this, you know, so often heroes, we tend to justify our mistakes. We tend to hide sometimes our failures when we have this hero mentality, this C plus R equals O mentality. And so, you know, similarly, there are people who realize that their responses sometimes are not adequate. They're not heroes. They don't see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as zeros. It's the same equation, but basically it's people who are looking at their life events and realizing that they are inadequate to meet the challenges that they're facing. And so often I think as writers, we have these kinds of challenges. It's not a big R, but it's a little r. And so these are the Minions. I love the little Disney Minion movies. You know, they're the kind of zero mentality. You know, and they have a different mindset. They wear a different set of lenses. You know, they're the ones who see their responses as inadequate. And I'm telling you what, these folks fill up doctors' offices. They fill up counseling offices. They fill up all kinds of places, thinking that their responses are inadequate. And that's what I call the zero lens. This is a picture of my 5 kids, by the way, and we call them the Fabulous 5. But you'll notice what people with the zero equation in their mind, what they say. They say things like, I'm not good enough. I'm inadequate. I can't do this. And so, so many times we oscillate between these two things, between feeling like we're a hero and feeling like we're a zero. Now what this looks like as writers sometimes, you know, if our book does well, if people notice our book, then guess what? We pat ourselves on the back, we're the hero. But sometimes when we publish a book, or we promote a book, or we launch a book, and it's crickets. Have you ever had that experience? How do we feel? We feel like a zero, don't we? It's that hero, zero. It's that seesaw of basing our acceptance on our performance. You ever thought that way about yourself? I think we all have those emotions as writers, is that we base our acceptance either for ourselves or for other people, or even for our spiritual with God, we base our acceptance on our performance. You know, when I first heard this equation from a self-help guru, at first I kind of said, well, that sounds kind of great. Of course, he didn't talk about the zero part. His whole focus was getting you from a zero to a hero. But the more I began to think about that, the more I began to think, you know, there's got to be something else. There's a missing factor here in this way of thinking. And I think so often as writers, we focus on our performance. We focus on moving from a zero to becoming a hero. And there's several things that are missing. First of all, we know, I've already told you two of those things. First of all, that having adequate responses, in a sense, from whatever worldview you want to look at it, is inadequate. We're just never going to measure up. We're going to be like Mr. Incredible. And the other thing is that often our responses hurt other people. You know, when we have that hero mentality. But there's another thing. If you think about this equation, I'm not a mathematician, but you know, 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay? 2 plus 2 is not 6. 2 plus 2 is not 8. And one of the problems with this equation is that it's defined based upon arbitrary absolutes. See, think about this. Who says that Hitler is right or Hitler is wrong and Mother Teresa is right or wrong? You see, and that's where we are in our culture right now. We have a culture based upon arbitrary absolutes. And we're talking mathematics. There's got to be another level of thinking in our lives. It's based upon absolutes. Now, for those of us who understand Christianity, we understand that Christianity is based upon absolutes. Not based upon what we understand in our finite understanding. There's something that's external, an external reference to us that we can begin to understand these absolutes. But there's another thing. You see, this C plus R plus O way of thinking, this hero-zero mentality, it doesn't match reality. Now, I know many of you we've all kind of coming out of COVID and just thinking about that. You know, I think about the fact that, and I've seen this so many times as a physician, we can have a perfect response. You know, we can give all the right medicines, do all the right things. Two people with the very same risk factors with COVID. One comes in the hospital, we do the very same thing, one dies and one lives. How do you explain that? I struggle with that as a surgeon because sometimes I oscillate between that hero and that zero. You know, you do everything right, you do the same thing, techniques, same tools, and yet one does really well and one has a bad outcome. How do we understand that? You know, and even in your writing, how do we filter that? You know, sometimes it seems like we write something and it just seems to be like a total flop. And sometimes the things that we think that, you know, really aren't that good, people just seem to love. Have you ever had that experience? Yes. And so I want to just introduce to you something, that there's a better way. Just to take courage. There's a better way to see yourself as a writer. A better way than seeing yourself as a victim or a zero or a hero. And that's what I call a third level thinker. It's a framework of thinking that's very different and introduces a different element into the equation. It's not a term. It's not something that adds and subtracts. You see, this multiplies this factor. Okay, once again, I'm mathematically challenged, but deal with me here. When we bring God into the equation, it does a lot of things. It changes the whole equation. But I think the thing that distinguishes Christianity from every other worldview, from every other spirituality, is something that makes it very unique, and that's grace. The fact that God does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. It even goes beyond that. That's really not even a good description of what grace is. I mean, that's even an inadequate description of grace. But I want you to think about adding this term into the equation. First of all, grace changes everything. It changes the whole equation in the way that we think about ourselves as writers. So, this is what I think the equation looks like here. See how grace influences And I've got a pointer if you notice. Notice how grace changes the outcome. How it objectifies the outcomes based upon absolutes. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to break this down. But how grace enhances our response on a deeper level. How grace changes the way that we see our circumstances. This is an adequate definition of grace, but grace, God doing for us what we can't do for ourselves. We know based upon the completed work of Christ, right, that God has done something for us and has already appropriated an outcome for our lives. Even in our writing, even that small part of our life maybe that we call writing, that God has a destiny and an objective and a purpose for our writing. Isn't that great news?
Yes, it is.
So, I want to talk a little bit about how grace changes the outcome. So, understand this objectifies the outcome, is that God has a specific purpose for our writing. So it's always purposeful. It's God honoring, right? In the third level, who gets the credit? God gets the credit. Who gets the honor? God does. And so it's also for our benefit and for the others and for the benefit of others. It's always objective and fair. You know, we all have these circumstances in our lives that sometimes just don't make sense, but understand that the outcome is always fair from God's perspective. And that's one of the things about the difference between social justice and from God's understanding of His biblical view of justice, that someday all of the wrongs are going to be righted. So, you know, whether God brings us out or whether God brings us through, I think this is on your handout, either way we win. Isn't that good news?
Yes. Yes.
Isn't that good news about us as writing? Whether our book is 8,644,832 on the Amazon bestseller list, or whether it's number one, that God is going to either bring us out or bring us through. Either way, we win. And this is a picture of my family. I have 5 kids. And this is, of course, Joanna, my wife. She's here. I tell folks, I'm the best guy to see on the worst day of your life. Joanna is the best person to see any day of your life. I mean, we go to baseball games and stuff, and everybody kind of flocks around Joanna. Now, when they see me, they're like, oh, that's him. And they go the other direction. But Joanna's awesome. And so this is number 3, Georgia Ann. And Georgia, and this is an outcome I never expected. I never expected this outcome. Georgia Ann is now illustrating a children's book with me called Climbing the Upside Down Tree, about 2 little boys in Africa, and one is living by performance-based acceptance, and the one is kind of learned the hard way through some mistakes to ask his dad for help. And she's making, and you know, never in my mind would I have thought of that outcome. So often, God's outcome for our lives is very different than the outcome that we desire, based upon that second level. God has sometimes a different goal for our writing. And so then I think about number 4. This is Jane Aubrey Rose. Now, Jane Aubrey Rose is our senior. She's a homeschooled kid, smart, writing her first novel.
Wow.
And then, I'm not going to embarrass Joanna today, but Joanna wrote a poem for a friend that we had that just died in the funeral, and it was the most amazing poem I've ever read. I'm like, wow, Joanna, why don't you get up here and do this today? But I'm just saying, thinking about this in our lives, sometimes as writers, we have this objective, we have this purpose that we think that we want God to do. And often, God has a very different objective for our lives. And so the question is getting in line with what God's doing in our writing. I want you to think of this as circles. Okay, there's a lot of different ways I can describe these equations. We can describe them as levels of a pyramid, like a ziggurat. You can describe them as lenses. I like to think of them as circles. You know, the first circle is that first level of thinking. You know, it's a small circle, isn't it? Not everything fits in that circle. But when you get into that bigger equation, the hero zero, the self equation, it's better. I mean, some things fit in that. I mean, it's definitely true. We can't minimize our responses. Our responses are important. But when you think about this grace equation, this life equation, whatever you want to call it, I want you to think, I mean, this slide doesn't even, I mean, the circle is bigger than this slide when you think about God's grace. It's bigger than New Orleans. It's bigger than the earth. It's bigger than the expanding universe. Everything fits in the realm of God's grace. And so just realizing that today in your life, I just want to encourage you. How does grace change the circumstances? So often grace changes the way that we see our circumstances. You know, it's funny, the first level I talk about crying over spilt milk. Well, we know that God often, and God can often deliver us out of our circumstances. You know, we know those Red Sea experiences, but so often grace begins by changing the way that we see our experiences and giving us a different viewpoint in those writing challenges that we face. So once again, grace changes our circumstances, first of all, by helping us see the opportunities that we have to honor God. You know, by helping us to experience God in new ways. Last night I was meeting with a friend of mine that we haven't seen in 10 years. We don't come over here to Louisiana much. You know, Texas people, I'm scared to come over here in this swampland. Afraid I'm going to get thrown in one of these swamps and get eaten by an alligator, okay? But I was visiting with a friend last night. He's a pastor in Baton Rouge, and his wife went through an advanced stage breast cancer. And as we just kind of listened to them talk about their experiences, you know, and she's now 6 years out, and it looks like, man, she's going to be fine. But, you know, had to go through chemo, surgeries, and everything. And as they began to share that, Billy was talking about how he was talking to his sons, who were in junior high at the time, about what it was going to be like if Mama didn't live. What a conversation. You know, and through that process, he said, you know, I'm so thankful. I mean, I would never want to go through that experience again, but now that I have, I realize that I have come to know God in a deeper, more intimate way than I never would have been able to, even as a pastor, even as seeing people and counseling people through this cancer and through difficult life circumstances. I would never be able to understand that. And so, once again, thinking about the connection between your circumstances and what God is moving in your life to write and create. Just think about that this is an opportunity to honor God, to experience Him in new ways. It's an opportunity to grow spiritually. It's also an opportunity to influence other people. You know, it's funny, when we go through a difficult crisis in our life, like my building burned, when my building burned in this little small town in Nacogdoches, man, everybody, I mean, it was like everybody's eyes were on me. I had an opportunity, it was like an amplifier. Everybody was watching. And I just want to encourage you, whatever you're going through, whatever you're thinking, if you're writing a devotional, thinking about those experiences, those painful experiences, you begin to write and to begin to share. Those are the things that will connect with people when you're writing. How does grace change our ability to respond to our circumstances? Well, if you think about it, this response is a faith response. Now, every level of thinking has faith. The question is, what is the credibility of the faith in which things are placed upon? And so we know on this third level, this faith response is one of cooperation. Once again, God already has a plan for your writing. God already has a purpose for your writing. The question is will we respond to those circumstances that He places in our lives, and will we begin to make those steps and cooperate? It begins with acceptance. And then we accept the reality of where we are. It begins with acknowledging our inadequacy, right? Then we move to adjusting our lives to meet and to measure to what God's doing in our lives. And then we move to that point of anticipating what God may be doing. There is a sub-equation here, this response equation. There's a lot of sub-equations in this, but just thinking about that. Our response is one to cooperate with God in our circumstances. So, grace enhances, and I have the E's for a reason, grace enhances our responses. And that's how grace changes everything. I want you to think about your writing, and I'm going to share with you some personal examples of how I feel like God's grace has helped me to take those next steps. You know, grace equips us, grace enlightens us, grace energizes us. You know, for some of you have a passion to write devotionals or prophetic stuff, and you know, what makes one person geared in that direction and one person in another? You know, all these things that grace does in our life. Grace empowers us. So my first book was a book that I wrote about my circumstances, Surrendered Sleep. It's probably not 8 million, it's probably 9,684,032 on the Amazon bestsellers book. You got to get this book because one way or another, if you read this book, you're going to get a good night's sleep. You know, but sometimes we have to fall forward, don't we? You know, sometimes we have to take the first step. When I wrote this book, this was really something that I didn't realize it, but this was something that was coming out of my own circumstances. I face a lot of different challenges in my life and in my surgical career. First of all, there's the things that race through my mind as I go to bed. Did I do this today? Did I forget this? Is that anastomosis that I sewed together? Is that going to heal tonight? Are they going to call me at 3 o'clock in the morning? Those kind of things race through my mind. And I think we all have those circumstances. And then the other thing is that I'm constantly being called in the middle of the night. People call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, "Hey doc, what you doing?" Why are you calling me at 3 o'clock in the morning? Is this something really, are they bleeding to death? Because if they're not bleeding to death, can it wait till 7 o'clock in the morning? You know, so anyway. I didn't take all my medicines today, by the way. Hey, but just thinking about this. And so then also I have some physical things. I struggle with sleep apnea. And so I have all of these dynamics coming together. And as I began to think about my life circumstances, I began to realize that God had a lot to say about sleep. I mean, sleep was God's idea. And not to get into the book too much, but understand that as I began to write this book, I began to realize that this book was for other people too, but it was more about me. Do you ever have that experience as a writer when you're writing your devotions or something and realizing that there's that connection between your circumstances, writing about what you know, about who you know, and the lessons that you've went through? So just kind of thinking all that together, how grace energized me as I began to look at all this stuff from different aspects and put all these components together about sleep, how that helped me dramatically. And understanding that, you know, fixing my physical problems was also linked to my spiritual issues. And a lot of the ways that I was addressing people and treating people was because I was sleep deprived all the time. And as I began to work through all those things, you know, all those things are linked. It really began to make a big impact on my life. So the other thing I realize is that, you know, sometimes, like I said, we fall forward. Right? Sometimes we have to make that first step. And this was a self-pubbed book, which I learned so many things through that process. First of all, I learned what not to do. Have you ever had that experience? I learned what not to do. And so, but you know, also I learned a little bit about how to do a good media interview. I learned how to do some interviews on the radio. I learned about how to make connections and all that kind of stuff and kind of begin to make those small steps into being an author. So my next book was a little different. I wrote it completely different. The first book I wrote more from a theological perspective because I wanted to get all the Bible verses right and get it right. I didn't want to mess up. This book was completely different. I kind of realized that I wasn't connecting with people. And so I wrote it more from an emotional level. But this also ties into my experiences. Two of my greatest challenges are time and distractions. I don't know about you guys. Yes. But I am constantly, I mean, it seems like there's always somebody who wants to distract me, you know. And fortunately, I have some good distractions too. I have Joanna, the best person to see on the worst day of your life, on the best day of your life, and I have my kids. But other than that, I'm constantly being distracted. And there's constantly this time where I have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do my writing. And one of the things I realize is that I can't write a long novel, this complicated story, because my brain is always being distracted. And so I had to take little bitty stories and make these little bitty tiny chapters, very similar to devotion, and take these, and because of my circumstances, it changed the way that I had to write. I was never going to be able to write a book like a big long novel that's complicated, you know, a 10,000. So I made little bitty stories, you know, like when you're speaking or when you're maybe teaching Sunday school class, there's that little story that you tell people, that little home run story with a little message. And that's kind of where Spoonfuls of Courage kind of surfaced. And I've got another book hopefully going to come out called Spoonful of Courage for Caregivers. They're kind of the forgotten sufferers. So thinking about that, how, and also I face these circumstances, these things that happen that you just can't wrap your mind around. I mean, emotionally, how do you deal with these things? I mean, like we had a little girl that hung herself. We had this little girl that came in, Dad was cutting down a tree and the tree fell on her. And now every time we go into town, sometimes I'll see this family, and of course when they see me, just these emotions. I mean, how do you deal with these kind of things? And so I began to realize that my writing, it was for other people, but it was also a way for me to begin to process these life events that I was going through. Once again, God places these circumstances in your life for a purpose and for an outcome. So that's kind of what we started with the Spoonful of Courage. And so, once again, if you think about how does grace change our response, first of all, we draw upon God's resources. So think about this. On a second level, whatever self-help guru you want to read or whatever talks about maximizing your performance. And I think so many times as writers, we focus on the technique. We focus on how to build your platform, how to do Facebook, how to do a YouTube, how to do this, how to do that. We focus on performance instead of drawing upon God's resources. When we focus on God's resources, His creativity, His ingenuity, His initiative, it takes us to a whole different level of writing. So once again, we experience freedom from stress and worry. Once again, because when we understand that ultimately, who's responsible in this equation? God's responsible, that kind of frees us up. Yes, it doesn't minimize our responses, but God is responsible for all of these things, and it frees us from a lot of stress and worry and anxiety. So often, if we're functioning on a lower level, we can look and see when we're stressed and we're worried and we're anxious about things, and we're not bringing grace into the equation in our lives. So once again, instead of performing for acceptance, on this level, performance flows from acceptance. Based upon the completed work of Christ, you're accepted already. And that's good news, isn't it? And so once again, there is a performance that flows out of that as writers. But just understanding that instead of performing for acceptance, performance flows from acceptance. And really our part begins to kind of join with God and figure out what He's doing, what the outcome He wants us to do. And when He initiates, we respond in cooperation. So, God supplies, we apply, if you're looking at your little sheet. So I want to talk about a little bit different twist here now, because all of us, I think, are in that issue of, okay, I'm a nobody knows who I am. And one of the problems with publishing is that you're trying to get your name out there, you're trying to get your work out there, and how do you do that? So this is my COVID story. So I was in Niger working in a hospital training surgeons when the president closed off the United States. And so I was trying to get a plane back into the United States, and this is a girl, by the way, this puts COVID in a whole different perspective. When you think about the fact that in some parts of the Sahara Desert, there are no doctors. There are no ventilators. There are no resources. And so, but as I was on the plane coming back, I was trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? Because once again, elective surgeries have been canceled. And I know this sounds kind of weird, but as a surgeon, I eat what I kill. Okay, that went over your head. Okay, but just thinking about that. So, I don't get a paycheck. I have to perform to be accepted, right? I live in that world. And so, what am I going to do? And so, one of the things that I've done, this idea came across my brain. Hey, I'm a doctor. I've written a book about sickness and suffering. Man, what a great opportunity. Here we are in the COVID crisis, and I've written a book about sick and suffering. There's going to be a lot of people that are going through a lot of things and a lot of issues. And so what I did is I got a publicist and I started doing radio interviews. I'd already had some experience doing radio interviews. And my publisher, for some reason, decided to give my book away for free on Amazon. So, which was great because I had about 4 reviews. And so, yeah, I mean, can somebody say, yes, I identify with that? So I began to go with that approach. I probably did 100 interviews talking about different aspects of COVID and vaccines and all this stuff, and giving away my book for free. And that really was a way for me to help kind of catapult my work into a different level. And by the way, today we've got these books and I've given them to the bookstore owner. So if you want a copy, I'm not going to make any money off of them. I want you to buy a book from the store and support the owner of this store. You got to realize these folks are struggling. I mean, with COVID. So we need to support especially our independent Christian bookstore owners and help them. So if you want a copy of the books, I think it's going to be a buy one, get two free or whatever. So buy a book that you want. I've always wanted to get here in the bookstore, and you'll get a copy of the book. So once again, being generous. Being generous was one of the ways that really kind of helped me. And what that did is as I began to do that, my publicist said, hey, listen, you need to start your own show. You not only need to be a guest, but you need to be a host. And so we started this show, Life's About Living, and we got on this network, and it's on a TV network, and we're slowly building that platform. We're interviewing people who share their everyday experiences. You know, I mean, I think that's the thing that we all struggle with is how do I get my message out to the people amongst all these other people and all these other messages. And so once again, realizing that it's a process. We all face these things, right? Challenges, skills, time, resources, connection. And I want you to realize that God has all of those things for us. We can just tap into what He's already doing. Once again, thinking about these equations. You can tell what level you're living on when you ask yourself these equations. Who's in control? First level, somebody else is in control. Second level, you're in control. Third level, God's in control, right? Real simple, but just going through all those things. Who gets the credit? Well, in the hero equation, it's very obvious who gets the equation. The hero zero. You get the credit. But see, when we begin to think through the lenses of grace, we begin to realize that in our writing, it's really about God getting the credit and God moving toward the objective that He wants in our lives. It's really interesting. Also, you can kind of figure this out by what you're saying. If you listen to yourself long enough, you'll begin to understand the level of thinking that you have as a writer, about what you're saying. If you're saying, if only this would have happened, then the outcome would be different. Well, you're thinking like a victim, right? And so really stopping and listening to ourselves and thinking about the way we think about, the things that we're going through in our lives. I want to share with you, this is a picture of an operation. It's probably good that you can't see the picture. It's a reflux surgery. And as I think back upon my life, I realize that I didn't become a surgeon overnight. It's a good thing, as I tell you this story, okay? It's a good thing. But I think it's the same for us as writers. Even with an operation, there's a set of steps that you go through, right? You put the patient to sleep, this even before that, all the preparation, putting the patient to sleep, there's preparing, there's positioning, and then each part of the operation has a step. And if you do all the steps right, it goes a whole lot easier. Trust me on that. But as I think about my life, I look back and go, well, how did I get here? It's been 26 years. I've been in practice now for over 20 years in surgery. How did I get here? As I think back, I reflect back on one moment that changed my life. And it's kind of weird. You see this is a pyramid. I'm into pyramids, ziggurats, the first level, the second level, the third level. So anyway, but this is Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. Have you ever been to the Yucatan? You ever been to Playa del Carmen or Cancun? Right in the middle of the Yucatan, there's these beautiful Mayan pyramids. And when I was in college, mind you, I went and I spent a month at a little clinic in the Yucatan Peninsula, working with this guy here. You can't see him. His name is Dr. Perez. He's a Spanish guy, neat fella, just a primary care doctor. We just shadowed him for a month. Once again, I was learning Spanish. I wasn't very good in Spanish, so I didn't understand everything. But there was a lot of things that were taught, that were caught instead of being taught. And here we are at the clinic of Promesa. I was there for a month, and this moment happened there in that clinic. They brought in this little boy, and he was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and he was yelling and screaming. And in those kind of those concrete houses, and it just echoes. And so there's this yelling and this screaming. This kid's covered with blood, and he was in a machete accident. And the family had carried this little kid down these little jungle trails to the clinic. And got him in this room, and he's yelling and screaming, and the nurses are trying to hold this kid down. If you've ever tried to hold a 6-year-old kid down, it's impossible. There's no papoose, okay? So they take us and they put us over in the corner. I'm over here in the corner, and I'm watching this thing unfold, and I'm like, oh my goodness. And so we've got 6 nurses trying to hold this little kid down. And interesting, you'd think that that the machete would have impaled his liver, but it was just a little laceration on the top of his head. Covered with blood, screaming. You know how kids are. By the way, it's good when kids scream when they're hurt. If they don't scream, it's bad. But anyway, different issue. But this kid was screaming, and we were all over the corner, and my legs were shaking. And Dr. Perez came in the room. He had been taking a nap, and he got up, and he saw the kid, put on his gloves, and began to kind of, close the cut. And he looked back over in the corner of the room and saw us kind of huddled like the Hebrew children over in the corner, just kind of scared to death, as this kid screaming. And he looked at me, and he said, he pointed at me, he said, Carlos, ayúdame. And so I'm trying to think, what'd he say? Because I'm not real good at my Spanish. Ayúdame. What are you saying? And then he took his hand and he pointed like this. He says, Carlos, ayúdame. In other words, he's saying, in Spanish, he's saying, come help me. And here it is. I'm a medical student. Okay? I'm not a medical student. I'm a college student. Okay? So, first of all, there is no YouTube videos. Okay? You can't just look at this. I've never seen anybody close a laceration. I've never read the book. I've never been to a class. And I can tell you all about the Krebs cycle, probably, which I can't even remember now. But I can tell you all that stuff. But I didn't know anything about this. This was way out of my league, and all of these things began to race through my mind. Man, I am not equipped to do this. I am not adequate. I'm not trained to do this. But yet, Dr. Perez was going, Carlos, ayúdame. And I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. And for some reason, I took that first step. And I went over there and began to work with this doctor. And Dr. Perez kind of showed me how to hold the needle and how to use, go with the curve of the needle and how to tie the knots and all those things. Man, I thought, and I kind of thought I was getting pretty good at this. The kid kind of went to sleep and he kind of stopped moving around. And man, I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. And then all of a sudden, after we finished, Dr. Perez looked at the kid and he said, Carlos, sácalos. So, what does that mean? I'm trying to figure this out in Spanish, and it says, you mean take it out. Sácalos means to take them out. I looked at the kid's face, and he looked like Frankenstein, By the way, this is why we call it the practice of medicine, okay? But here's the point. And here's the point, the thing that I learned. That step set me on a path towards a trajectory, that God's grace was working in my life in a moment that I was not even aware of it. And so I want to just encourage you today. God is working out a purpose and a destiny for your life. And so just kind of realizing too, and as I look back, I think, what if? What if I would have never took that first step? I mean, some of you have mentioned today that you're in the middle of a book, kind of bogged down in the middle of a book. And I just want to encourage you to keep taking those steps. What grace tells us, okay, is that God is in control, and that God, like Dr. Perez, is calling us, and He's saying, ayúdame. Come help me. Okay? I've got this figured out. I just need you to take the steps that you need to take today. And so as you think about that and you take those steps, I just want to encourage you that grace is there all the way. Trust steps out in faith even when the way seems blurry. Like that slide right there. It's a little blurry today, isn't it? But just trust steps out. And so I want to encourage you to think about this, that your life as a writer, and this is a big picture talk, just take the next step. And when God initiates and gives you an opportunity, you may feel inadequate, okay? But it's not about your adequacy. It's about God's adequacy and what He can do and what He's purposed through you. It's been a pleasure being here today. Been a real pleasure. I just want to encourage you just to keep it going.